Hey, you're watching TC McCarthy, the most handsome and entertaining science fiction author on video. Welcome to my channel, and today we're going to have a special treat. I'm doing a two-part series on a topic that maybe some of you are aware of, maybe some of you aren't. Now, an article was published back in May, I think, of this year, 2018, about a scientific discovery based on a couple of researchers, one in the US, one in Switzerland, where they had looked at mitochondrial DNA and traced our ancestry back to just a couple of beings or a couple of humans back, I think, 100 to 200,000 years ago. So before I get into that, let me explain why mitochondrial DNA is so useful when you're trying to trace this back. And of course, the impact is something along the lines of what we've been seeing a lot of recently, which is we're seeing a lot of confirmation of things from the Bible, of all places, in archaeology, and now we're seeing it in terms of studies into the human genome. Now, you can imagine that has quite a few scientists in an uproar. Many scientists really don't want to hear that their information confirms things that are quoted in the Bible, but we're going to go ahead and deconflict some of that stuff and see what we come up with at the end. Now, what does this have to do with my new series coming out in July of 2019? Pachoo! Well, it doesn't have anything to do with the first book, but one of the overall kind of tropes or themes or plot lines in the series that I have planned is the origin of mankind and where we got our start. So, you're going to have to bear with me on this one. It's not going to be made clear in book 1, but by book 3 you should start getting a clue as to why I'm researching these sorts of things. So, mitochondrial DNA, why is it useful for looking at ancestral kind of features and looking at the history of mankind? Well, unlike normal DNA, mitochondrial DNA resides in the mitochondria, not in the cell nucleus. And it is inherited. When a mother and father get together and create a baby, the DNA is all mixed together and it makes things convoluted. Mitochondrial DNA is just passed down from along the mother's genome. So it originates with a mother and then gets passed on from one generation to the next. They're also present in large numbers within the cell, so you need a smaller sample potentially than you do with regular DNA. So when you're looking at tissue samples, I don't know, tens of thousands of years old, I'm guessing that maybe it's a little bit easier to collect and somehow scrape together enough RNA material to go ahead and do these kinds of studies. And you'll have to excuse me, sometimes I get confused and say RNA when I meant DNA, and what I meant was DNA when I just said that. So now that we've got RNA versus DNA versus mitochondrial DNA versus regular DNA figured out, what did these two scientists discover? Well, one of the scientists, Mark Stuckel from Rockefeller University in the United States, and David Thaler at the University of Basel in Basel, Switzerland, analyzed the mitochondrial DNA, which they referred to as, I don't know if they referred to it or if this is reported in the press, but basically somehow they got referred to as barcodes, and we can think of it that way. DNA is in a way a barcode, but it's a little more complex than that. They analyzed, I think they took millions and millions of samples from different species, not just mankind, not just humans. And although I said earlier that mitochondrial DNA is passed down from one generation to the next through the mother's genome, which is true, errors do creep in. The copying is not always exact, and then of course you also get other ways to form mutations. And so these two authors were able to use those kinds of errors or mutations to measure time. Now, I'm not going to go into the details in that. I don't think it's a very hotly disputed topic, but I'm guessing there are some scientists who have some problems with the way this is done, and they may be able to criticize the way in which these two researchers have done it. But I haven't seen that. I've read a few critiques of this particular study, and I'll get to that. I haven't seen that in any of the critiques. That's a really, really cool thing to be able to do. And what they found was shocking, that somewhere around 90% of the species on Earth today, including humans, started giving birth to their offspring roughly somewhere over 200, maybe 200,000, maybe 250,000 years ago. Now, there are many reasons for why that might have happened that way, assuming this study is accurate and true. And you can imagine all sorts of things that we all know about from reading history books, watching YouTube. You know, if you watch this channel, I've mentioned it a couple of times, and that is Earth has a history of cataclysmic extinction level events that put a stop to one line of evolution or creation or whatever your viewpoint is on that, and another one begins. I think there are either 5 or 6 kind of major extinction events recognized by geologists, paleontologists, etc., and they are roughly, I think, millions. We're talking, the latest one is millions and millions and millions of years ago, not 200, 250,000 years ago. But that doesn't mean that other things haven't happened that were near extinction or that really put a lot of stress on any populations alive on Earth at the time that happened. And we have many examples of those happening throughout history as recently as tens of thousands of years ago. Now, we're not saying that this is evidence of Adam and Eve existing on the planet 200,000 years ago, but it does seem oddly consistent. And I think that's what has people this is a very polarizing study and result. And so I think there's a big divide between the camps arguing one point or another. It does argue that we came from some sort of a creation event around that time period. And another interesting result is that rather than having some sort of evolutionary path that one would expect where everything branches off from one origin and kind of goes in its separate ways over long periods of time, what you see is that there's very separate and distinct sets of DNA from species to species with no indication really that we all originated with the same one. Now, I don't know how much to make of that because 200,000 years in geologic time and probably evolutionary time is not that much time. It's a relatively short period of time. When you consider that the Earth is 4-point-something billion years old, 200,000 is literally like a blink of the eye. Now, there is one subtlety to this study that basically separates, a lot of religious people are saying, aha, proof that we didn't evolve, that we were put here in some sort of, instantaneous creation event, and that's not entirely true. What the study is very clear to point out is that they are evolutionists, the people who wrote this study, and that these species existed long before the 200,000 year event occurred, 250,000 years, whatever it was. But here's the really interesting thing is that despite the fact that we do trace back farther than that, these authors point out that something happened roughly 250,000 years ago that kind of created entirely new populations from already existing species. So if you understand that subtlety, it's very strange. It's unusual. And in some ways, it is consistent with creationist theory. So this has a lot of people scratching their heads. And you can imagine when you've got scientists who are evolutionary biologists versus this type of study, I don't know, I don't have any inside information, but I'm guessing there's basically a big battle going on right now, and I'm going to get to some of the criticisms in a second. And then the other thing that this study suggests is that rather than there being one continuous kind of evolution of animal varieties, when they look at the DNA, they see everything as what's called quantized, arranged in discrete kind of packets or sets of barcodes, basically suggesting that maybe evolution doesn't play as strong a role in the creation of new species as one would expect. Again, this is like a dagger in the heart of evolutionary biologists. And in walks Michael Marshall from the BBC. Actually, he's British. I can't remember if it's the BBC or another publication. But anyway, here's a person who's Oxford educated or Cambridge educated, I can't remember which, has a very impressive intellectual pedigree, and has just written his first book. And so what's the first rock that Michael Marshall throws at this entire theory? Well, you got to be careful with mitochondrial DNA is one thing he argues, because it's only a subset of the information that we have on a given generation, regardless of what species you're looking at. And you can miss things. You're looking at a small subset of things in this particular study with the methodology they use, and it's easy to miss certain events or certain things in terms of mixing between species and different types of things like that. Now, if you're confused by his argument, I'm right there with you. I read that and started scratching my head going, really, I don't understand what you're saying. Not because I'm stupid, I have a PhD in science after all, but because I think what he's trying to say is poorly argued, or it just totally makes no sense whatsoever. And then he argues that there's no trace of some sort of extinction level event happening within the last 200,000 years or so. Although he doesn't say that exactly. What he says is there's no notable event that basically happened in that time period that would have basically, caused at least some spike in extinctions. But he's wrong on that front for sure, because I'm going to do a second video after this one and going through all the things that happened in the last 200 to 250,000 years that would be consistent with some sort of cataclysmic event happening on the Earth, anything from mega volcano eruptions to large asteroids impacting somewhere on the planet, maybe multiple ones. Then he talks about the findings going from 100, the authors state it was anywhere from 100 to 200,000 years, and somehow that's too wide of a time period. It's too vague. And my answer to that is, dude, that's how we work in geology. You know that. You know that. Well, actually, Michael might not know that, because here's one of my biggest criticisms of him. And I'm not trying to be a jerk, but I do notice that sometimes when non-scientists start going after things like this, they miss the nuances, they miss the specificity of the arguments being made, because they might have their own kind of idea on what's right and what's wrong. And in Michael's case, he is not a scientist. He is not a scientist. He's well educated, but he's not a scientist, never has been. He's a science writer. Those are two separate things. Also, I mentioned this earlier, he's writing a book, and it's a book on evolution. And I wonder if maybe this theory kind of flies in the face of whatever it is he's writing about. So before I start part 2, I'm going to dig a little bit into that as well, and be able to tell you at the beginning whether or not this particular theory somehow contradicts something that Michael Marshall is writing about in his book. Now that's it for part 1 on this. Again, we've gone through the theory, we've gone through how it kind of is consistent with some of the things stated in the Bible, and how basically our DNA and our mitochondria somehow suggest we all come from separate quantized kind of packets of information flying in the face of evolutionary biology, and that we may have originated from, maybe not Adam and Eve, but a small subset of individuals who survived some sort of cataclysmic event about 200 to 100,000 years ago. To give you a taste of what's coming up in episode 2, plenty of things happened 100 to 200,000 years ago that could explain something like this, and plenty of species went extinct during that time period, contrary to what Michael Marshall stated erroneously in his article. I'm TC McCarthy. This has been another episode of the Tyger Burning series that I'm putting out. Buy my books in July of 2019. End transmission. Hey, TC McCarthy here, the most eclectic and entertaining science fiction author on YouTube, maybe even the internet. Thanks for watching this video. I really appreciate you guys tuning in. As usual, buy my books. I've got a new one coming out in July, and I'll have a giveaway coming up soon, so stay tuned for that. Appreciate you subscribing to my channel, and please, 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 please don't forget to click that little bell icon so that whenever I upload new content, you get notified. Thanks again. See you soon.